Today, we're going to talk about the man who wouldn't die. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts to never miss a video upload. Let's get started. In the summer of 1932, the Great Depression was still rearing its ugly head. So the Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. It went from 1929 all the way to 1939. In 1929, Wall Street had crashed and it wiped out millions of investors. Consumer spending dropped, investments dropped, and this caused declines in just about everything, including industrial output, which meant that employees were actually going to be laid off from their jobs. By 1933, 15 million Americans were unemployed, and nearly half the country's banks had failed. So obviously this time in history was a really depressing time, hence the name the Great Depression. People struggled to feed their families, they didn't have work, they didn't have money for food. It was a really, really horrible time to just try to survive. And during this time, one man named Tony Marino sat in his speakeasy and was devising quite an extreme plan. Tony, who was having drinks with his friends, Francis Pasqua and Daniel Kreisberg, the trio came up with something quite evil. Tony told them that he was working with a corrupt life insurance agent, and he could take out life insurance policies against people that frequented his speakeasy. And they came up with this plan that basically Tony was going to give them credits and let them drink themselves to death. And when they died, he would collect the money. Pasqua, who was 24 at the time, was an undertaker by trade. And apparently an undertaker prepares bodies for funerals or cremation or whatever is happening. So as they're sitting and drinking and coming up with this plot, Francis Pasqua looks over to Tony and he says, "Why don't you just take out insurance on Malloy? And after you do that, I can take care of the rest." Apparently, Michael Malloy was this old man who showed up every day to Tony's speakeasy in the Bronx. And every time he arrived, he'd say, "Another morning's morning, if you don't mind." And then he'd basically just drink himself until he passed out at the bar. And for a while, Tony would just let Michael Malloy rack up a credit at the speakeasy. And that's until Michael Malloy stopped paying his credits. And of course, it's during the Great Depression. Business is already bad. So they're struggling to make money, and he's letting people drink on credit. And now this person, specifically Michael Malloy, is not paying his credit back. So he's effectively losing money. So nobody really knew anything about Michael Malloy, other than obviously he came in to drink every day. He was Irish. They didn't know anything about his family. He didn't seem to have any family or friends for that matter. He had no definitive date of birth, but they guessed he was about 60 years old. He didn't have a vocation or a trade. And most of the times he would just sweep up alleyways or collect garbage. And he didn't even want to be paid in money. He wanted to be paid in alcohol. So obviously he had an alcohol addiction problem. So Francis Pasqua told Tony, hey, let him drink for free. It's really not going to be hard to kill him. He drinks a lot of alcohol as is. He's really quite on the verge of death anyways. So let's get him to drink himself to death. I'll take care of the rest. But apparently this wasn't the first time that the 27-year-old Tony Marino had pulled off this scheme. Apparently the year prior to this incident, he had befriended a homeless woman named Mabel Carson, and he basically convinced her to take out a $2,000 life insurance policy in his name. And one night he literally force-fed her alcohol. He took off all her clothing, and then he would take ice water, buckets of ice water, and pour it all over her and her mattress. He would then push her bed to a window, and he opened the window, and at this time it's winter, it's freezing in New York, and she would die. She would sleep through the night because remember, he poured alcohol down her throat. She's literally so drunk she can't move. And he opens the window and he leaves her. The medical examiner would list her cause of death as pneumonia, and Tony collected that $2,000 life insurance policy. So $2,000 in 1931 would be equivalent to about $38,000 and some change today. So that was a chunk of change. And remember, the Great Depression is happening. People don't have any money. They're looking for food and shelter and work. And he's over here convincing a homeless woman to take out a life insurance policy and name him as the beneficiary. And when he murders her, he does get more than $38,000 in today's money. That's a lot of money. The third person in this trio, Daniel, was actually a grocer and a father of three. And he basically said he participated because he needed money to feed his family. And as they're kind of sitting at this bar and they're talking amongst themselves and they're looking over at Michael Malloy, Tony says he looks all in. He doesn't have much longer anyways. The alcohol's getting to him. And he kind of looks over at Daniel and he's like, are you in? And the three of them decide that this is what was going to happen. They were going to kill Michael Malloy. So basically Francis decides he's going to do all the legwork for this plot. So basically it took him about 5 months, but he did end up getting 3 life insurance policies. And they covered double indemnity, which meant that in the case of an accident, the life insurance would cover it. So at this point, there's quite a few people involved, and they're going to have to split this money, obviously, to keep everybody quiet. And they basically divide this money up to be $3,500 and some change for every single person involved, which would be equivalent to about $54,000 in today's money. And that is a chunk of change. Apparently, they would also bring in some of Tony's other customers who were regulars and had a criminal background. They brought in John McNally, Edward Tin Ear Smith, because his artificial ear was made out of wax, Tough Tony Bastone, and apparently his sidekick, who people would basically say was like his slave, Joseph Maglione. And in December of 1932, they began to gather and discuss killing Michael Mallory. So basically they started by just giving Michael Mallory an open tab. And obviously this thrilled him. That was his favorite pastime, was to drink. And apparently Michael would just drink until Tony's arm got tired from holding a bottle. He drank so much and he was still alive. And this shocked the crew. But Michael Malloy had been drinking all of his life. He was a seasoned drinker. So one night of very intense and heavy drinking wasn't going to kill him. So basically he got up, he thanked them for having an open tab, and he walked out. He said he'd be back, and he did come back the next day. Michael Malloy would keep coming back for 3 days straight and just excessively binge drinking. And Tony's over here looking at this man like, why aren't you dying from this? Like, how do you not have alcohol poisoning? And then on the 4th day, Michael Malloy would stumble into the bar and he'd say, boy, ain't I got a thirst. So obviously the crew is growing impatient. They're wondering why this guy isn't dying. And one of them's like, why don't you just shoot him? And they're like, well, we can't really do that because obviously that would be a homicide and the insurance won't cover it. So instead of giving him whiskey and gin, they actually gave him wood alcohol. And apparently wood alcohol can cause blindness and it can kill you if you drink enough of it. And that's basically a type of alcohol that's used to make antifreeze, pesticides, windshield wiper fluid, paint thinner, and other substances. So obviously you would not want to be ingesting this. And wood alcohol will catch fire very easily, and it's obviously very poisonous. And I just want to be clear, they weren't serving him like mixed drinks. They wouldn't put the wood alcohol with his whiskey. They were literally just feeding him wood alcohol. And they watched as they're giving him these drinks of wood alcohol, very poisonous, and Michael Malloy is just downing them one after another. And he showed no signs of obviously being poisoned. He just acted drunk. And Michael Malloy would drink all of the wood alcohol that they had been offering him that night. Shot after shot, he just kept taking them. He got up, he said goodbye, and he went home. And he would come back the next day for more. Night after night, he kept coming back. He was drinking wood alcohol. And these men are looking at him like, what is wrong with this man? He literally will not die. We are poisoning him, and he's still just drinking it and surviving night after night. And then one night, Michael Malloy actually fell to the floor. So they all kind of gathered around him that night, and they're listening to him to see if he's still alive, and they're kind of seeing if he's breathing still. And he was breathing, but it was really kind of slow and labored. And they're just sitting there and they're tensively watching this man. Or they're like, okay, this is it. He's gonna die. And then Malloy starts to snore. And he would awake some hours later and literally say, give me some more of the old regular, me lad. And the crew is just flabbergasted by this. This man is not dying. They're now spending money not only on alcohol, but wood alcohol. And they're not getting anywhere. He just keeps waking up and drinking more. And of course they had to pay the insurance premiums to keep the insurance plans so that they could kill him, and that's adding up too. And Tony is thinking, my speakeasy is gonna go bankrupt at this point. It's the Great Depression, people aren't drinking, they're not coming in, and he's frantic about this. So they decided that because Michael Malloy loves seafood, that they would take oysters and soak it basically in this poisonous alcohol and then feed it to him. So again, they're spending money on seafood. So they fed them to Michael Malloy, and he enjoyed the oysters, drank some wood alcohol, and then he licked his fingers and continued to drink. He didn't die, of course. Then they would find sardines, and they'd basically do the same thing and mix it with poison and feed it to Michael Malloy, and this didn't kill him. Michael Malloy would finish the sandwich and he'd ask for another one. And so of course the crew got together. They're like, okay, we need another plan. This is not working. In fact, we're just spending money on this guy. He's enjoying himself. He's drinking alcohol, he's eating oysters, he has no care in the world. So one night they put Michael Malloy in the back of the car, they drive him to a park, they strip him naked, they throw him on a bench, and it's wintertime. They dumped water all over his head and his chest. Michael Malloy was sleeping at this point. He never stirred. He had no idea what was happening. And apparently they left Michael Malloy to die. And the men just knew that this was it. The next day they'd be collecting that life insurance and things would be better. When Tony arrived at the speakeasy the next day, he found Michael Malloy in the basement. Michael Malloy had literally walked half a mile from where they left him in the park to the speakeasy. And he had persuaded one of the workers to let him in, and he went to the basement and he was still cold and frozen. And when he came to, he told Tony that he felt, quote, a wee chill. And obviously murder is not comical at all, but the fact that Michael Malloy just kind of kept popping up and nothing was happening to him is just mind-boggling. They literally left him for dead in a park, frozen, naked, and he just walked half a mile back and went to the bar and was like, it's a little bit cold, I'm gonna sleep in the basement. Mind-boggling. So obviously they had to do something else, and they decided the best way to kill Michael Malloy was to run him over. So they all jumped in the car with Michael Malloy at their feet. They drove a few blocks. They dragged Michael Malloy down the road, and they basically held him up like a crucifix. His arms were outstretched. They were ready for the car to run him over. And they're speeding at him, and one of the men yells stop because the light went on above them, and he assumed that a woman had woken up and turned her light on, and he didn't want them to get caught. Eventually that light would go out, so they'd start again. And Michael Malloy actually managed to jump out of the way of this car twice. And then finally, on the third time, he was actually able to run over Michael Malloy at about 50 miles an hour. And when he hit him, he actually looked back and reversed the car and ran over him again. And so this gang of people were like, okay, he's dead, finally. But then they saw a car approaching, so they all jumped in the car and they drove away immediately because they didn't want to get caught, obviously, running this man over. Eventually, a week goes by, and they're obviously calling hospitals, and they're trying to figure out if this man was found and if he was dead because they need to collect the life insurance policy. And at this point, they're just decided that they're going to kill any old drunk in this tavern and pass him off as obviously Michael Malloy. That way they can collect the life insurance policy. But 5 days later, Michael Malloy walked into the tavern. He was obviously limping and he was really bruised and beaten up and battered. And when he came in, he said, I sure am dying for a drink. So this man was run over at 50 miles an hour, and then a car backed up on him. And 5 days later, he shows back up at this bar with a gang of people that are trying to murder him. And he's like, hey, I'm back. I cannot even imagine what everybody was thinking at this point. I mean, at this point, they probably should have just stopped with this plan because it is freaking ridiculous. Okay? They can't kill this man. He's the man that won't die. And they still continue to try. So Michael Malloy comes in, he sits down, he's like, wait until I tell you guys what happened. He's like, all I could really remember is the taste of whiskey, and then the really cold, frigid night air. And then he said, I seen some rushing lights, and then everything was black, and I woke up in the hospital. And then on February 21st, 1933, Michael Malloy would actually die. Michael Malloy was actually found with a rubber tube running down his throat, and that rubber tube was actually connected to a gaslight fixture, and a towel was wrapped tightly around his face, presumably to keep the tube in his mouth. So a friend of Francis actually filed a false death certificate citing pneumonia as a cause. This crew would only receive $800 from the life insurance company, and Tony would actually go on and buy a new suit with his cut of the money, which just is completely flabbergasting because he was so worried about his speakeasy going bankrupt, and then the first thing he does is go out and buy a new suit after this life insurance supposedly pays out. So obviously they did have 2 more life insurance policies, and when they questioned the insurance agent about it, the insurance agent's like, we need to see the body. And the crew is like, well, he's already buried. So of course an investigation ensues. And then of course everybody starts talking during this investigation and implicating one another. And of course they're all going to be charged with murdering this man. Obviously they were convicted of murder because they forced gas down his throat with that tube, and that led to his death. And Tony and his accomplices were sent to the electric chair at Sing Sing, and they were all put on death row, and they eventually were electrocuted and died in 1934. This case was just bonkers from beginning to end. When I read about it, I knew that I had to share it with you guys because I just could not believe this story. As I was reading, I kept thinking, why didn't they just stop? Because obviously this was not working. They shouldn't be trying to kill this man in the first place, and he wasn't dying. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so let me know in the comments below. That's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If you have a suggestion for a case, pop in the comments below. And in the meantime, check out another video on my channel while you wait for the next upload. See you next time.